The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October, carried by a postal rider who had ridden hard through 2 days of Wyoming wind to deliver it to the Iron Gate of Clearwater Ridge Ranch. Caleb Whitmore stood on his porch in worn leather boots, holding a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, weathered in the way that only honest labor and honest grief can weather a person. His dark hair carried threads of silver at the temples, and his eyes, the color of Wyoming sky before a storm, had the particular stillness of a man who had learned to hold his sorrow privately. He turned the envelope over in his calloused hands. The return address read Millhaven, Ohio. He had advertised for a wife 2 months prior, a practical matter, placed in 4 newspapers across 3 states, carefully worded. Honest character required above all. Widower, age 37, a working ranch, a boy of 7 who needs a mother's steadiness. He had received 9 responses. He had read 8 of them and felt nothing but polite indifference. The 9th had arrived crumpled and slightly water-stained, as though it had been carried a long distance by uncertain hands. Caleb sat down on the porch steps, set down his cold coffee, and opened the letter. Inside was a single, small photograph. The woman in it was not posed. She was not smiling the practiced smile of someone who wished to be admired. She was caught mid-thought on a porch, her dark hair pulled back simply, her hands folded in her lap over what appeared to be mending. Her eyes, and this was the thing that stopped Caleb Whitmore cold, her eyes looked directly into the camera with an expression he recognized instantly and deeply. She looked like a woman who had long since stopped waiting for the world to notice her. He read the letter. It was plain in its language, oddly formal in places, and touched with something that felt like quiet courage beneath every line. It described a woman accustomed to hard work, a woman who cooked well and kept accounts carefully, a woman who made no great claims for herself, only this: I am reliable. I will not leave. I know how to be present for those who need it. Caleb Whitmore read that last line 3 times. He did not yet know, could not have known, that the letter had never been written by the woman in the photograph, that it had been written as a cruel joke by 3 golden-haired sisters who had laughed themselves breathless sending it off, that the woman in the photograph had no idea her name had been signed to it. All he knew, sitting in the cold Wyoming morning with the letter in his lap, was that something in him had gone very still, the way a river goes still in the deep places where it runs truest. He went inside, he took out paper, and he wrote back. Eleanor Hart, Ellie, to the few who thought to call her anything at all, had been born 3rd in a family of 4 daughters in Millhaven, Ohio, and had spent the better part of 24 years perfecting the art of occupying a room without disturbing it. Her sisters were luminous in the particular way of women who know they are being looked at and have arranged themselves accordingly. Constance was golden-haired and quick-laughing. Adelaide moved through a room like sunlight. Josephine, the youngest, had inherited both the beauty of the older 2 and the easy confidence that beauty, when it arrives early, tends to bestow. Ellie was none of these things, and she had made a quiet peace with that fact, the way a person makes peace with weather, not without grief, but without the exhausting hope that things might change. She was not ugly. She was simply unremarkable by the standards of a world that moved quickly past unremarkable things. Her hair was dark brown, her eyes a steady hazel, her hands always ink-stained or needle-calloused. She read everything she could find. She kept the household accounts with perfect precision. She grew tomatoes and beans in the back garden, preserved them carefully in late summer, and made the kind of bread that disappeared from the table without comment, because it was so consistently good that no one thought to remark upon it. She had loved once, quietly, in the way she did all things, a schoolteacher named Thomas Avery, who had eventually married Constance instead, because Constance was the kind of woman a man noticed first and remembered longest. Ellie had said nothing. She had mended clothes on the porch for 3 weeks afterward and let the grief move through her like weather. By October of that year, she had reached a kind of numbness that she dressed each morning in practicality and called contentment, because it was tidier that way. She did not know that her sisters had found an advertisement in the back pages of the Cincinnati Ledger. She did not know they had spent one rainy afternoon laughing over the wording of a response, copying out Ellie's own practical phrases in mimicry, pulling a photograph of her from the parlor mantel, sealing the envelope with theatrical ceremony. "Someone ought to marry her off to a Wyoming rancher," Josephine had said, wiping tears of laughter from her cheeks. "He'll get a good cook and a woman who'll never argue. Poor man won't know what he missed." They had mailed it and forgotten it almost immediately, the way people forget the small cruelties that cost them nothing. The reply came 3 weeks later, addressed to Eleanor Hart in a firm, careful hand. Ellie found it in the Morning Post before her sisters were awake. She stood in the cold kitchen and read it twice. The man's name was Caleb Whitmore. He was 37 years old. He was a widower. His wife Margaret had died of fever 3 years prior, leaving behind a son named William, now 7. He owned a ranch in Red Bluff, Wyoming Territory. He was not, he wrote with a directness that caught her breath, a man who required beauty or performance. He required a partner, someone steady, someone who understood that a life built quietly, day by day, was still a life worth building. He had read her letter, the letter she had never written, and he had found himself thinking of it for 3 days before writing back. He did not explain why. He simply said, "Something in it felt honest." And honesty, in my experience, is rarer and more valuable than anything else a person can offer. He asked if she would be willing to correspond further, with the understanding that if they found themselves in agreement, he would pay her train fare to Wyoming. He made no promises beyond that. He would not ask her to come to a stranger's house under false pretenses. He only asked if she was willing to try. Ellie sat down. She read the letter a 3rd time. She looked out the kitchen window at the gray Ohio morning, at the elm tree she had climbed as a child, at the garden she had tended for 15 years and would tend for 15 more if nothing changed. Then she got up, found paper, and began to write back in her own words, terrified and trembling and more alive, she realized, than she had been in years. She did not tell her sisters. They would have laughed. She understood with a certainty she could not quite name that this was hers and hers alone, the first thing in 24 years that belonged entirely to her. They wrote to each other for 6 weeks, 7 letters each, hers careful and honest in a way that sometimes frightened her, his measured and unexpectedly warm in a way she had not anticipated from a man's plain advertisement. He wrote about William, the boy's love of horses, his habit of naming every stray cat on the ranch. He wrote about the mountains that rimmed Clearwater Ridge at dusk, how they went purple and then blue before the stars came. He wrote about missing having someone to share the quiet with. She wrote about bread and garden and books. She wrote about the elm tree and the Ohio winters. She did not write about her sisters. She did not write about being invisible, but she wrote very carefully and very slowly about wanting something of her own. By the 6th letter, Caleb Whitmore had asked if she would come. And here was the thing that sat in Ellie's chest like a stone. She had not written the first letter. She had not posed for the photograph. Everything he thought he knew of her initial courage, the reaching out, the bold response to a stranger's advertisement, was built on her sister's joke. She was, in a sense, a woman who had arrived at the door of something real through a lie she had never told. She lay awake the night before she meant to book her train fare, staring at the ceiling, and asked herself the hardest question she had ever asked herself. Do I have the right to go? She thought about it a long time. She had been honest in every letter since the first. She had hidden nothing of who she was, her plainness, her practicality, her quietness, her love of reading, her skill with accounts, her particular brand of careful, unhurried steadiness. Every word since the first had been true, but she had not corrected the beginning, and the beginning was built on a joke. She rose before dawn, dressed in her best wool coat, and walked to the train station to ask about the westbound schedule. She told herself she would tell him the truth when she arrived. She would explain everything, and if he sent her home, then at least she would have had Wyoming. At least she would have had the mountains going purple at dusk just once in her life. She boarded the train on a gray November morning with a single trunk, a tin of bread she had baked the night before, and the particular courage of a woman who has decided, at last, to stop waiting to be noticed and simply to move. 3 days on a westbound train is a long time to be alone with one's thoughts, and Ellie was well acquainted with both. She watched Ohio give way to Indiana, Indiana to the flat, stretching plains of Kansas, and then slowly, so slowly the change was imperceptible until suddenly it wasn't. The land began to rise. By the second evening, the horizon had grown teeth. The Rocky Mountains emerged from the distance like a dream she hadn't known she'd been having. She pressed her face to the cold glass of the train window like a child. Red Bluff, Wyoming was a small, serious town. One main street, a general store, a feed merchant, a small church with a white steeple that caught the last of the afternoon light. Caleb Whitmore was waiting on the platform. She recognized him from the single small photograph he had sent in his second letter. Tall, dark-haired, going silver, serious-faced in the way of men who have borne real sorrow. He held his hat in both hands. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Two people in a November wind, measuring the distance between what they had imagined and what stood before them. He said, quietly, "Miss Hart, I'm glad you came." And she said, because it was true, because it was the first fully true thing she could offer, "I'm glad too. I need to tell you something important, but not here." He nodded, as though he had expected as much, and said nothing else. He took her trunk without being asked, and loaded it into the wagon, and they drove in silence through the cold dusk toward Clearwater Ridge, the mountains enormous and close and real around them, the sky going precisely the shades of purple and blue he had described. William was waiting on the porch with a lantern. He was small for 7, dark-eyed and solemn in the way of children who have learned early that adults carry grief, and he watched her climb down from the wagon with an expression of careful assessment that reminded her, achingly, of herself. She crouched down to his level without thinking. "You must be William," she said. "Your father tells me you name all the cats." The boy blinked. Then, very slightly, his mouth curved. "The orange one is Senator because he talks too much." Ellie laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and something in William Whitmore's small face shifted and opened, like a door that had been closed a long time. That evening, after William had been put to bed and the ranch had gone quiet except for the wind against the eaves and the low sound of the fire, Ellie sat across from Caleb Whitmore at the kitchen table and told him everything. She told him about the advertisement she had never seen, about the sisters, the laughter, the cruel joke of the letter, about finding his reply in the Morning Post and standing in a cold kitchen reading it 3 times. She told him about 6 weeks of honest letters built on a dishonest beginning. She set her hands flat on the table and looked at him steadily and said, "If you want me to take the morning train back to Ohio, I'll understand it. I won't ask you for anything, but I needed you to know the truth before you made any decision about whether I should stay." The fire crackled. The wind pressed at the windows. Senator the cat appeared from somewhere and wound around the legs of the table. Caleb Whitmore was quiet for a long time. He poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her and held his own and looked into it. "I read your first letter 11 times, he said finally. Not because it was remarkable, because something in it felt like a person who was exactly who she said she was. I didn't know then that it wasn't your words, but I'll tell you what I know now." He looked up. "Every letter after the first was yours, and every letter after the first is what made me ask you to come. The first letter got my attention. The next 6 are what made me want to know you. So if you're asking me whether the beginning matters enough to end what might come after," he paused and set down his cup. "The answer is no, Miss Hart. It doesn't." Ellie had been holding herself very carefully together for 3 days on a train and an entire evening of uncertainty. She did not cry, but her eyes went bright and she breathed in the way a person breathes when they had been holding their breath so long they had forgotten they were doing it. She stayed the week, as they had agreed. It was a working arrangement. She cooked meals, she helped with the household accounts, she walked the property with Caleb in the mornings while he explained the ranch to her in the quiet, detailed way of a man who loves what he has built. She learned that Clearwater Ridge ran 600 head of cattle and kept 12 working horses, that the hay barn had a leak on the north side that had been meaning to be fixed for 2 seasons. That the kitchen garden had gone to ruin after Margaret died and hadn't been touched since. She noted all of this with careful attention, and by the 4th day she had quietly begun sketching plans for the garden's revival in the margins of the account ledger. Caleb found the sketches on the 4th evening and stood over them for a long time without speaking. William, who had taken to following her from room to room with the faithful attachment of a small, solemn planet orbiting a new sun, asked her on the 5th morning if she knew how to make apple cake. She did. They made it together. William standing on a footstool at the kitchen counter, his small face set with the tremendous concentration of a child undertaking something of deep importance. When it came out of the oven and filled the whole kitchen with the scent of cinnamon and warm sugar, he turned and looked at her with an expression that undid her completely. "Mama Ellie," he said, simply and without ceremony. "Can I call you that?" She had been called many things in 24 years. The plain one, the quiet one, the sensible one, the one left behind. She had never been called Mama anything. She crouched down beside him, the way she had on the porch the first night, and she looked at this small, serious boy who had been motherless for 3 years, and who looked at her as though she were simply, quietly, the answer to something he had not known how to ask. "Yes," she said, "you can call me that." That evening, Caleb sat beside her on the porch steps as the stars came out over the mountains in their extravagant Wyoming numbers, and he said, not looking at her, in the careful, sideways way of a man who has learned to hold himself lightly around tender things, "I'd like you to stay, Ellie. Not because I need a housekeeper, not because William needs a mother, though Lord knows he does, but because I haven't sat on this porch in 3 years and felt that the quiet was good rather than empty, and tonight it's good." She looked at the mountains. She thought about the porch in Ohio, the elm tree, the endless gray mornings of mending other people's things. She thought about a woman who had spent 24 years being invisible, and how she was sitting now under a sky with more stars than she had ever seen, next to a man who had read her letters 11 times and found them worth reading again. "I'd like to stay," she said. "I'd like that very much." They married in the Red Bluff Church on the first Saturday of December, with the mountains white-capped and the sky a hard, perfect blue. The ceremony was small. The minister was brief. William stood beside his father in a suit that was slightly too large, holding a small bunch of dried sage because it was December and there were no flowers. And when Caleb placed the ring on Ellie's finger, William reached up and took her other hand without being asked. She wore her best dress, the dark green wool freshly mended, and carried nothing, and was the most beautiful person in that church in the way that people become beautiful when they are exactly where they belong. The life that followed was not a storybook life. It was a ranch life, hard and seasonal, and full of the small dignities and indignities of real work. There were difficult winters and difficult cattle markets, and a summer drought in their third year that tested everything they had. There were arguments, as there are in any honest marriage, and silences that had to be worked through carefully, and nights when the weight of grief pressed close and had to be named. But there was also this, a kitchen garden that came back to extraordinary life in the spring under Ellie's patient hands, producing tomatoes and beans and a climbing rose she had brought from Ohio in a tin, which wound itself over the porch railing and bloomed crimson every June. A boy who grew tall and open-faced and laughed easily, who called her Mama Ellie until he was grown, and then simply Mama, who brought his own children to Clearwater Ridge in later years and told them the story of how his parents had found each other as though it were a legend. There was a man who learned, slowly, the way men learn the things that matter most, that the best part of any day was coming in from the range at dusk to find a light in the kitchen window and knowing what that light meant. Who began, in their second year, to leave small things on her pillow, a stone from the creek that had caught his eye, a sprig of sage, once a hawk feather of such particular beauty that she kept it in her Bible for the rest of her life. And there was a woman who discovered, in the mountain-shadowed valleys of Wyoming, that she had never been invisible, only unseen, which is a different thing entirely. That she had never been unremarkable, only overlooked. That the life she had thought was passing her by had simply been waiting, in the way of all the best things, for the right moment and the right place. Her sisters wrote eventually, curious, then astonished, then finally, to their credit, genuinely glad. Constance visited the summer of the second year and stood in the kitchen garden with her mouth slightly open and said, "Ellie, you built all of this." And Ellie, who was canning tomatoes at the counter with William's youngest on her hip, looked around at the kitchen she had made warm and the garden visible through the window and the mountains beyond that, and said very simply, "Yes, I suppose I did." There is a particular cruelty in being overlooked, in spending years in the same room as the people who love you and yet somehow never quite being seen. Ellie Hart knew that cruelty better than most. But here is what Clearwater Ridge taught her, in the patient way that good places teach the people who are brave enough to arrive at them. Being seen is not the same as being known. And being known, truly known, the way Caleb Whitmore knew her after 7 letters and a lifetime of quiet mornings, is worth more than 1,000 rooms full of admiring eyes. The joke her sisters played was careless and unkind, but the universe, in its peculiar wisdom, took that carelessness and made something from it that 3 golden-haired sisters, for all their beauty and easy grace, never quite managed to build for themselves, a life that was wholly, entirely, irreplaceably her own. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes, on winter evenings when the fire burned low and the mountains were black shapes against a sky full of stars, Caleb Whitmore would take his wife's ink-stained, needle-calloused hands in his and say nothing at all. And Ellie would lean her head against his shoulder and listen to the ranch settled around them and feel in her bones the extraordinary, ordinary miracle of it. She was home. She had always been worth finding. The world had simply needed someone patient enough to look. Friends, if this story found its way into your heart today, if Ellie's quiet courage reminded you of someone you love, or perhaps of a part of yourself that has waited too long to be seen, then Desert Hearth is exactly where you belong. We believe that the most extraordinary lives are often the quietest ones, the ones lived with steadiness, with love, and with the particular bravery of simply showing up, day after day, for the people and the places that matter most. If you haven't already, please take a moment right now and subscribe to Desert Hearth. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to us, because it means these stories will find the people who need them most. Hit that subscribe button below, ring the bell so you never miss a story, and if this one moved you, share it with someone today who needs to be reminded of something simple and true. You have always been worth finding. Until next time, keep the hearth warm.